Now, before I even start this video, let me say, this information is for those of you who are new to emulation and are not sure what ROMs and emulators are and how they work. So if you're an expert at this already and you're still watching, don't be in the comments talking about we already know how to do this, because you wouldn't believe how many comments I get on my videos asking about what they are. Okay, so if you ever tried to play an old video game on your computer, then you've probably come across the term ROM. It's a word that floats around gaming communities, emulation sites, and retro gaming discussions, but what you want to know is exactly what is a ROM and how does it work? Well, let me break it down as simply as I can. So ROM stands for read-only memory. It's a type of computer memory that stores data permanently, unlike the memory in your phone or computer's RAM, which gets wiped clean when the power turns off. ROM keeps its information. That's why your old cartridge games from systems like NES, Genesis, and N64 still hold their data decades later. When people talk about ROMs online, they usually mean ROM files, digital copies of data that used to live inside a game cartridge or an arcade board. So when you download a ROM of, let's say, Streets of Rage 2, you're getting a copy of that original data that was stored on that Genesis cartridge. It's basically the same game, just in a digital form. Now, to understand how ROMs work, it helps to know where they come from. Inside every old video game cartridge, there's a small chip. That chip contains all the code, graphics, and sound that make that game run. When you plug that cartridge into a console, the console reads that chip's data directly. No downloads, no updates, just raw game code. Over time, people found ways to copy that data using special hardware called a ROM dumper. A ROM dumper connects the cartridge to a computer and reads the data bit by bit. Once copied, that data can be saved as a file on your computer. That's what we call a ROM file. Think of it like scanning a photo. You're not changing the picture, you're just turning it into a digital version you can store and view later. Now that we've got a ROM, you need a way to actually play it. And that's where emulators come in. An emulator is a piece of software that mimics a video game console. It pretends to be the original system, like an NES, Sega Genesis, or PlayStation. So the ROM thinks it's running on real hardware. The emulator reads the ROM file, reads its data, and recreates the game's behavior on your computer screen. For example, if you open a Game Boy ROM in an emulator, the emulator acts like the Game Boy's brain. It runs the same code the Game Boy would run. It responds to the keyboard or controller as if they were the buttons, and it sends the visuals to your monitor instead of a handheld screen. It's like digital time travel. So why do we use ROMs? There are a lot of reasons people use ROMs. Some just want to relive their childhood games. Others are collectors who want to preserve titles that are hard to find or too expensive. A few use them for modding, speedrunning practice, or creating fan translations of games that never left Japan. I remember the first time I played NBA Street Volume 2 on my laptop. I didn't own a PS2 anymore, but through a ROM and an emulator, I was able to experience that great game that I remembered as a kid. It felt like bringing a piece of the past back to life. For many people, that's what ROMs are about, nostalgia and preservation. Now, enough about that. Let's get a little more technical without getting confusing. Okay, every video game, old or new, is made up of code and assets. Things like sound, graphics, and level data. In old cartridges, all of this was buried into the ROM chip. So when you load a ROM file on an emulator, the emulator reads that exact data and interprets it like the console's processor would. The ROM contains instructions written for a specific type of hardware. For example, NES games were made to run on an 8-bit CPU. The emulator recreates how that CPU behaves. So when it reads a line of code from the ROM, it responds the same way a real NES would. That's why emulation can be tricky. Each console has its own quirks, timing, sound chips, graphic processors, and the emulator has to imitate all of them perfectly. If something's off by even a little, you might get glitches, missing sounds, or a game that runs too fast or too slow. It's kind of like trying to act like someone else down to their exact speech pattern and facial expressions. Small differences stand out. ROMs come in all sorts of file extensions. You might see things like .NES, .SFC, GBA, or .ISO. Each one represents a different console or medium. For example, .NES for Nintendo Entertainment System, .SFC or .SMC for Super Nintendo, .GBA for Game Boy Advance, .ISO or .bin for CD-based systems like PlayStation. And for Nintendo Switch emulation, you will see NSP, which is the format for games downloaded from the eShop, and XCI, which are dumps of physical games. These ROM files, they all vary in size as well. NES games might only be a few hundred kilobytes, while PlayStation games can take up hundreds of megabytes because they include full audio and video tracks. When you open these files in an emulator, the emulator identifies the format, interprets the data structure, and starts the game just as the original console would. Now, for most of your disk-based consoles like your PlayStation emulators, they require a BIOS in order to run your ROMs. A BIOS is a copy of the original console startup system or operation system that prepares your games to run. Now, you may be wondering, why isn't the BIOS built into the emulator? Well, it's because they contain copyrighted material, and because of that, if the emulator builds it in, it could get shut down. The same thing goes for Switch emulation as well, which you are required to have emulation keys called prod.keys, which basically work the same as a BIOS. Without the prod.keys file, your Switch ROMs won't work on a Switch emulator because Switch games are encrypted. The keys will decrypt the games and run them. Now, with all of that being said, let's talk about the part that always sparks debate, that being downloading ROMs from the internet, which has always been a gray area because in many cases, it's illegal. I mean, the data inside those ROMs is copyrighted, and distributing or downloading them without permission violates copyright law. But let's be honest here, we are all going to the internet anyway and getting our ROMs, legal or not. And many gamers also argue that ROMs help preserve history, and I 100% agree because old cartridges, they wear out, consoles, they break, and some games never get re-released. Without ROMs, entire pieces of gaming history could just disappear. Now, if you're someone who wants to stay on the safe side, you could dump ROMs from your own cartridges or official re-releases. That way, you're playing games you already own. But come on, I mean, how many people really own huge collections of physical games to dump? I mean, let's be real. And the last thing I want to talk about are ROM hacks. So once a game exists as a ROM file, people can tinker with it. People can modify ROMs to create new versions of old games, adding new levels, characters, or even changing the story. Some famous examples include Pokemon Prism, Super Mario 64, Last Impact, and Mothers 3 fan translation. ROM hacking lets fans of these games express creativity, fix bugs, or translate games that never had official releases outside Japan. It's amazing to see communities take old code and turn them into something fresh. I'm all for it. And just like ROMs, with a quick Google search, you can find and download these ROM hacks as well. Nowadays, even with digital stores and game streaming, ROMs still play an important role. We rely on them to archive old titles and keep them playable for future generations. Not everyone can afford vintage consoles or rare cartridges that will one day die on us anyway. I mean, let's be honest. So at the end of the day, ROMs are not just files sitting on a hard drive or an SSD. They're living history, waiting to be played again.